Welcome to the deep dive. For years, the conflict between the United States and Venezuela was just simmering. It went from this quiet corporate handshake to a full-blown ideological war.
And that war, you could say, finally boiled over on January 3rd, 2026. That's when we saw the U.S. military operation Absolute Resolve.
An operation that ended with the pretty dramatic capture of President Nicolás Maduro.
It was an incredible moment. But what's so fascinating, what we're really diving into today, is that this wasn't some isolated event. The capture in 2026 was, well, it was the logical endpoint of more than a century of history.
Exactly. And at the very heart of this entire story is Venezuela, a country that is, either blessed or maybe cursed with the world's largest proven oil reserves.
We're talking over 300 billion barrels. That kind of wealth has been an engine for prosperity, sure, but it's also been the fuel for nearly every major conflict the country has faced.
So that's our mission today. We want to peel back all those layers. We're going to trace the history, the ideology, the economic forces that led to this direct military confrontation.
And we really have to ask the central question. Was Operation Absolute Resolve about international justice? Or was it, a cold, hard geopolitical move to secure oil and maybe even more importantly, to defend the American dollar?
Let's start at the beginning then. If you look back to the early 1900s, oil completely transformed Venezuela. I mean, it went from a pretty poor, rural, agricultural place to a global energy player almost overnight.
And that, of course, put it right on the radar of some very powerful nations.
Immediately.
Which brings us to a key moment our sources point to, the 1902 Venezuelan crisis. Venezuela was basically drowning in debt, and European powers, we're talking Germany, Britain, Italy, they sent gunboats, they blockaded Venezuelan ports to force them to pay up.
And the American response to that is what really sets the tone for the next 100 years, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Theodore Roosevelt steps in, makes this big show of force, and essentially tells the Europeans to back off. This is the debut of his big stick policy. It sent a very clear message. The Western Hemisphere was now America's sphere of influence. Its backyard, so to speak.
Any instability or any outside interference
would be met with American force. That doctrine became the quiet framework for everything that followed.
So for decades, the relationship kind of settles into what the sources call these ironclad ties. If we fast forward to the 1950s, under dictators like Marcos Pérez Jiménez, you had American giants Exxon, Mobil pouring billions into the oil fields.
It was a very straightforward transactional relationship. American companies got a guaranteed flow of cheap oil, and the Venezuelan regime got the investment and, the political backing it needed to stay in power.
It's incredible to think that the U.S. actually awarded Pérez Jiménez its highest civilian honor during that time.
It is, and it's almost darkly ironic now. But it just goes to show the relationship was all about capital and control. Ideology didn't really matter, not as long as the oil was flowing.
That was the deal.
Precisely. That was the foundational trade-off. But of course, those kinds of purely transactional deals, they rarely last, especially when nationalist anger starts to bubble up from below.
And that anger just exploded in 1999. The whole era of the ironclad partnership just screeched to a halt with Hugo Chávez.
Chávez was a complete ideological reversal. His Bolivarian revolution was openly socialist, fiercely nationalist. And his first big move was to seize the main asset.
The oil field.
He nationalized the holdings of the state oil giant, PDVSA. And he was constantly on television railing against what he called Yankee imperialism.
That was a direct hit on U.S. corporate interests, but he didn't stop there. He immediately started building this adversary alliance right in America's traditional sphere of influence.
Oh, he was bold. He set up oil for doctors deals with Cuba. He started having nuclear talks with Iran. He's buying weapons from Russia and signing huge infrastructure deals with China.
He was basically turning Venezuela into a foothold for anti-Western powers.
Exactly. You mentioned this rise of multipolarity, and that's the key. For the listener, what that really means is the U.S. couldn't just take its regional dominance for granted anymore.
So when Chavez is making deals with Russia and China, he's not just buying tanks.
No, not at all. He was giving these rival global powers a significant geopolitical base of operations right in America's backyard. It made the conflict so much bigger than just Venezuela. It became a proxy struggle.
And that clash hit a major flashpoint really early on. In 2002, there was that brief coup that pushed Chavez out of power for a short time.
Yes, and here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources confirm that evidence later surfaced of U.S. foreknowledge of that coup. Maybe not direct support, but they knew it was coming.
Declassified documents showed meetings between U.S. officials and the coup plotters.
Right, and whether the U.S. actually orchestrated it or not almost doesn't matter. For Chávez, that discovery solidified his entire narrative that Washington was actively plotting to get rid of him.
And after that, the diplomatic relationship just went into a total freefall. Diplomats were expelled. The rhetoric got so heated. I mean, Chávez famously stood up at the UN and called President George W. Bush the devil.
And the U.S., in turn, started labeling Venezuela a sponsor of instability, a major security threat. But all this political drama was really just the opening act.
The warm-up.
Exactly. The real existential threat Venezuela posed to the U.S. wasn't about rhetoric. It was economic. It was a direct attack on the foundation of the U.S. dollar itself.
Okay, this brings us to the absolute core of the conflict, and it's something we have to break down. The petrodollar system. This is so often the missing piece. Can you explain what the petrodollar is and why Venezuela challenging it was such a massive risk?
Absolutely. The petrodollar system goes back to the 1970s. After the gold standard collapsed, the U.S. made these key deals, most famously with Saudi Arabia, to make sure that pretty much all global oil sales had to be done in U.S. dollars.
So no matter who is buying or who is selling.
Exactly. If Germany wants to buy oil from Nigeria, they first have to buy U.S. dollars to make the purchase.
It's like a mandatory global tax that only benefits the United States.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It creates this huge, perpetual global demand for the dollar, which lets the U.S. finance its massive debts. It stabilizes the currency. It basically secures American financial power.
And Venezuela, with the world's largest reserves, starts actively bucking this system.
They went all in on de-dollarization. They started selling huge amounts of their oil and other currencies, the euro, the Chinese yuan. They even experimented with their own cryptocurrency for trade. It was a clear, coordinated attack on U.S. financial control.
And the fear in Washington must have been that if a big producer like Venezuela gets away with this.
Then who's next? Russia, Iran, maybe even a major Gulf state. That potential domino effect could seriously weaken the dollar.
So that's what triggers the U.S. counterresponse, the escalating sanctions that start around 2015.
And these weren't just slapping travel bans on a few officials. They went straight for the jugular. They targeted PDVSA, the state oil company, cutting it off from international finance and crucial technology.
And while the official justification was always about corruption and human rights abuses, and look, those were definitely real problems, we can't ignore the devastating human cost of this kind of economic siege.
The consequences were just catastrophic. PDVSA was the country's only real source of revenue. Crippling it led to hyperinflation, a total collapse of infrastructure, and massive shortages of food and medicine.
Which led to one of the biggest refugee crises in the world. Our sources say over 8 million people fled the country.
It's a true tragedy. Millions of people caught between these two massive geopolitical power plays.
It really is. And as things got more intense, the U.S. strategy shifted again. It moved from being about financial pressure to framing Venezuela as a direct security threat, specifically narco-terrorism.
This is where we get into the maximum pressure campaign. The U.S. starts building this narrative around the Cartel of the Suns, alleging that top Venezuelan officials, including Maduro himself, were running a massive drug trafficking ring.
Which sounds like a very strategic legal move.
Oh, it absolutely was. It allows for a much broader range of actions. So you had the sanctions, but then you also had criminal indictments. In 2020, the U.S. officially indicted Maduro on drug charges. They put a $15 million bounty on his head, which they later raised to an insane $50 million.
So it's no longer a political dispute. It's now framed as a war on organized crime.
And that's the legal justification for what comes next.
Which takes us right to the final acts. By 2019, the U.S. had already recognized the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate president, basically severing all remaining diplomatic ties.
And then the pressure campaign just went into overdrive, especially in the run-up to 2025. They were no longer just relying on financial tools. They started using actions that were, well, they were almost military in nature.
The sources list out several really aggressive moves.
That's right. We saw mass deportations of Venezuelan gang members back to Caracas. We saw terrorist designations for groups like Tren de Aragua. And then, much more aggressively, you had airstrikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean.
Killing over 115 people, according to the reports, and they were seizing oil tankers on the high seas.
Each of these actions was tightening the noose. They were establishing the precedent and the legal justification for a final intervention. They were showing the military action was on the table.
Which brings us to the climax. Operation Absolute Resolve, January 3rd, 2026. After years of this economic chokehold, the security framing, U.S. forces strike Caracas. They capture Maduro and his wife.
And the U.S. government declares it will oversee Venezuela's political transition and, crucially, its oil wealth.
So when you connect all the dots, what does it all mean? You have this ideological clash from Chávez, this economic defense of the petrodollar, and this geopolitical move to get rid of an anti-Western foothold.
All wrapped up under the banner of fighting narco-terrorism. That's the...
But the operation itself created this massive international debate, didn't it? About the rule of law.
Absolutely. The U.S. framed it as justice. Here's a narco-dictator with a $50 million bounty on his head. But many international law experts immediately called it what it was, a clear violation of the UN Charter. You can't just invade a country and grab its leader.
So you have this profound split. Was it justice, or was it a raw geopolitical power play?
And the real cost, as always, is borne by the millions of people who became refugees, caught between the defense of a currency and the control of a resource.
It's really a modern version of that early 20th century big stick policy, but this time the stakes were so much higher because it was about the dollar itself.
It's a classic case of history rhyming, if not repeating.
Which leaves a pretty powerful question for you to think about. As oil keeps flowing and these global alliances keep shifting, was the 2026 intervention the final, stabilizing end of an era? Or was it just the spark that ignites a much broader, more unpredictable chaos from rivals who now see this as proof of American overreach?
The consequences are still unfolding. We've covered the ground today, tracing that path from ironclad partnership to absolute resolve. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.